We're kind of coming in, and just want to say good afternoon to everyone, and just maybe give a few introductory comments right before we get started. Thanks for tuning in. Obviously, we have a drought situation across the state. Obviously, also the South Georgia folks have really hit the brunt of this so far, and it's coming north, and we're just getting prepared basically, and hopefully with all this preparation we get lots of rain. That's what we really like to see is do a bunch of drought stuff, and we never actually have to use it very much. But it seems at this point that at least for South Georgia that you're very much going to need some planning, going to need some preventative maintenance along the way. You may recall back in the earlier part of the last week, we had an agenda set forth where Tammy Cheeley would be talking today, but unfortunately, Tammy Cheeley had to reschedule, and thankfully, Dr. Lisa Baxter is going to switch out her week from week 3 to week 1, and today we'll cover managing toxic weeds in pastures and hayfields. And so one thing that we forget about is, sure, we need to provide forage and try to bring some stuff to these cattle during drought situations, but sometimes they go searching and go looking, and that's one thing that, wait a minute, I've got a dead one, and we talk, what's going on? And so that's the preventative maintenance part that we want to try to focus on this afternoon. And so if you have questions, please feel free to put comments into or questions into the chat, and we will address those at the end. We want to keep these kind of succinct and short for the most part. So around 20, 30 minutes, somewhere in there, we'll start answering any questions that you may have, and then we'll conclude at that point. And again, Dr. Lisa Baxter, thank you for joining us this afternoon and taking your time out of your busy schedule. Just go ahead and start and get us kicked off, and any other comments you may have before we get going.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to give a pretty good overview of how these questions tend to come in for me on the forage side of things. But it's definitely not an all-inclusive presentation. So we'll give links to other resources and where you can find information and help refine some of this. So to get started, I do want to let you know that we are in the process of pushing this particular bulletin out. It's at one of the final stages of review now. And so everything that I talk about in here, plus more specific control recommendations, will be in this bulletin. So hopefully we can get it posted in a draft version in the next week or so. It will be posted on our Georgia Forages webpage, probably front and center, so that everybody can find it and it's a timely topic. But also, we'll make sure that it's linked to the UGA Beef Drought Hub and then our social media channels that correspond to those two pages. So you should be seeing it out and about, hopefully, in the next week or so. It's unfortunate it got held up and hasn't been pushed out quite yet. So a disclaimer that I like to talk about, or disclose here before we go into toxic weeds, is Lisa is not a veterinarian, and I am definitely not an animal scientist. So I am coming at this from the agronomy and weed science side of things. If you suspect that any livestock animal has consumed some sort of toxic plant species, we strongly urge you to contact your local veterinarian for an official diagnosis, and they may refer you to one of the state labs for a necropsy so that we can further identify what the actual problem was. So, a common thing that I hear is that, well, I didn't have toxic weeds until I had drought. And drought itself does not cause toxic weeds, but it will increase their incidence in the grazing system. So when we have those drought conditions, no brainer, we have more limited forage. There's more or less forage that's going to be available for our animals. And that leads us down one of two paths, and often both on many farms. The first is we've got hungry cows, they're going to be searching for something. We start grazing areas that are not our normal pastures. When we have hungry animals that are being turned out, they may start to select and graze certain plant species that normally they would avoid. A lot of toxic weed species don't taste very good to the animal. They have tannins in them, or they're kind of bitter, or there's some sort of thorns, spine, roughness to the plant. So, for the most part, animals are not looking to graze many of these species until that forage is limited, and that's the only green thing that's left out there. Where I probably get more of the questions, though, honestly, is from animals being turned into areas that they wouldn't normally be turned into. When our pastures start getting a little short, it's not uncommon to say, we'll just graze the driveways, the alleyways, and the lanes. We'll see animals turned into woodland areas that may still have some grass under the trees, and unfortunately other toxic species. But even if you've got a fairly large yard, you may turn animals out. And there's a lot of ornamentals like rhododendrons and azaleas that are toxic to livestock. So while drought doesn't cause these weeds to be more toxic or to increase them or anything like that, we do tend to see more calls because of these two factors. So the best advice that I have for you today is to get out and scout. There's many of these species have a very rapid symptom onset, and to the point that death is going to occur within minutes or hours. And we don't have vets available at just down the road throughout all parts of the state. So if we suspect that this has occurred, we're likely not going to be able to get a vet there fast enough. So we need to prevent this from happening. We ideally would walk and scout the entire area before we turn those animals in, but everybody's busy. So some areas that we need to pay particular attention to would be any fence lines or wood line areas. That's where a lot of these species tend to naturally grow and may start emerging out of. Any overgrown area that's kind of brushy, and then ornamental areas, especially if it is a lawn or landscape type area, to get a feel for what potentially toxic ornamentals are out there. So we're not going to go through, each species. I got them grouped in bigger categories and general recommendations, but identification is key there. There are some pictures that you can take that can help your extension agent identify these plants, or you can use AI through some sort of application. I use PlantNet, there's Picture This, Google Lens, there's lots of different ones out there that can help with this identification. And if your extension agent can't identify them, then they can forward them on to us at the state level to help with that. So when you're taking pictures of those plants, we want to make sure that we get a picture of the entire plant so that we know what the structure looks like, any leaves that are on there, and specifically for grasses, where that leaf connects into that stem is critically important. If there's a seed head or flower on that plant, fantastic. That really helps narrow down those options. We're not always that lucky though. I get a lot of pictures that are very blurry and out of focus, and cell phone cameras are fine for taking these plant sample pictures. We don't need a big fancy camera for that. So what is usually the problem is the camera doesn't know where to focus to bring that into view. So use a solid color background. Any of those items there will work. I usually put them on my truck bed, or I'll take my sweatshirt off and lay it down and take a picture. If it's something that's an oddball size, we'll throw a common object like a cell phone or a pack of crackers or something to show how big or small that particular plant is. And I promise no agent or specialist will be upset if you send multiple pictures. So the more we have available to help with that identification, the better. So toxic weeds tend to fall into three large groups. We have our annual broadleaf weeds, our perennial broadleaf weed species, and then we treat shrubs and trees pretty similarly. These first two categories, and we'll talk about them more in just a second, are honestly pretty easy to control. There's lots of herbicide options available for this category. The challenge comes in of the optimum time of year to control and spraying the right product at the right time on the right species. Unfortunately, we tend to get calls on these when they're headed out, going into reproduction. they're not going to be very receptive to that herbicide, and we're not going to see a good efficacy there. Or we'll get them when they're like 6, 7 feet tall, and that's also not the time to control those species. The shrubs and trees are a little bit more difficult. They're not impossible to control. They are just more of a challenge because we don't have a lot of products available from the forage side to control these. So our toxic annual broadleaf weeds include the list that you see there, and you may not see all of them in every part of the state. I would say the two of from this list that I get the most questions on are going to be perilla mint and suspania. Depending on where we are in the state, I'll also hear it called coffee weed. And honestly, they all get treated about the same way. They're very common all around the state of Georgia, depending on the time of year. There's some cool and warm seasons listed there. And we have a lot of herbicide options available. I will jokingly tell people that, open the pest control handbook to the forage section, you throw a dart, you're probably going to land on a product that will control many of these when they are the ideal height for control. So most broadleaf herbicides will work. Many of these can be controlled with 2,4-D dicamba type products. There's a lot of sulfuron type products out there. We can go with an aminopyrrolid to give us more residual activity. And there's a lot of combo products available that work really well for things like perilla mint. So we have all of those in our Georgia Pest Control Handbook. We don't always list every single trade name that is available, especially for some of those very common active ingredients. So I do encourage you to check that specific product label before applying it to your pasture or hayfield. Our perennial broadleaf weeds are a little more problematic and difficult to control than the annuals, but not by much. There's a list of them there. I've encountered most of them throughout South Georgia. I get calls from them from North Georgia as well. I would say the two from this list that I get the most calls about is going to be buttercup in North Georgia, especially as you get into Northwest Georgia, and then horse nettle's pretty common down here through Southwest Georgia, but we get calls for it everywhere. These are fairly common. We may not see them in every pasture in the county, but they're fairly common out there. You could look and probably find them during their particular growing season. And while it feels limited, we do still have plenty of herbicide options available for this category. Again, many of these weeds can be controlled with very inexpensive broadleaf products at the right stage. And unfortunately, for things like buttercup, that correct stage was late last fall, early winter. So we may just not be at the right time of year to chemically control some of these, unfortunately. Again, most of those cheap broadleaf products will work, or the very broad spectrum broadleaf products. If something has a woodier stem to it, then we would pick a product that has a mixture with triclopyr or picloram in there. And there's several trade names available with either one of those products in there. Again, you can find that list in the Georgia Pest Control Handbook. The labels are really easy to find online if we need to confirm their safety for that particular pasture species that you're going to be spraying it on. The last one that I don't get calls on, even weekly, is the woody shrubs and trees. And that's because these aren't common in pastures. When we do get these calls, it's because we're turning animals into areas that aren't normally treated as a pasture, or we've had a major weather event, and with fences down or trees down, animals are gaining access to some of these species. I get probably the most calls from this list about black cherry. And again, we know to keep it out of our pastures, but if we're turning animals into other areas, we may not be able to catch everywhere that it's out there. So this is one of those that we strongly encourage scouting for these species. Our herbicide options are pretty limited for shrubs and trees because, again, we don't tend to see these in grazing areas. So you may have other options if it's an area that's never going to be grazed so that you can keep it from ever encroaching onto that pasture. But our options are extremely limited when it's in a grazed area. Some of these species will respond to triclopyr. It's what their kind of go-to product for woody species. But unfortunately, most shrubs and trees on this list or otherwise are, if they're in a pasture or hayfield, we are restricted to spot treating with glyphosate, unfortunately. So if there is just one plant out there, a shovel may be your friend, but we are very limited in this particular category just because they're not common species in those grazing land areas. We talk about prussic acid and nitrate a lot from the forage side of things and the grazing side of things, but there are other plant species that would fall into these weed categories that on their own they're not toxic, but things like pigweed and others and Johnson grass, they can accumulate nitrates, and then things in the sorghum family like Johnson grass can also have that prussic acid potential. You can see on the screen there, and watching the recording later, you can pause and really read into that. But they both end at the same point here where it's going to react in the animal. The compound will react in the animal very quickly, and we have animal death before we can often get a vet out there. We strongly recommend testing, and lab testing is going to be our most accurate option for determining the level of prussic acid or nitrates in that material. I wish we had better field tests available, but overall, they are fairly unreliable, or they're so limited in the scope of how you can sample that field that it just doesn't give you a good representation of that area. And the lab tests, if we're going to send them in, are only as good as that sample that we take. And I know many of you have heard that before on the forage and soil sample side. But the challenge, and as it relates to grazing management, is that it represents the forage at that moment. And so, if it takes a week to get that result back, and your plant has grown or not grown or become more stressed, whatever it may be, that sample reflects the state of that forage or that weed species a week ago, not today. On the stored forage side, this is a no-brainer. We got to test for those nitrates. Prussic acid we can test for. We just don't tend to see it as much in stored forages unless it's something in that sorghum family. So we could cross that bridge when we get there. But this is our general guidance for feeding that higher nitrate material. Again, most of the time we're fine on the nitrates, but when our plants are stressed and if we haven't uh, had sufficient rain and good growth from that material following that drought stress event and that fertility event, these nitrates can spike pretty quickly. So we do want to be cautious of that material. I see very few samples above that 18,000 part per million mark. And so everything can be fed. We just have to be strategic in how we do it. So, with that being said, practically for any material that can accumulate the nitrates or has that prussic acid potential, whenever I get the call and I'm talking through with the county agent, I say, if there is a concern for either one of those, there is a thought in your mind that it could be there, don't graze that day. Let's wait. If we put out fertilizer and it never rained on it, even if it's been a couple weeks, do not graze. It depends on the product for how long it would just hang out there without being incorporated, but that risk is too great. So if it has not rained, do not graze. That being said, if we get a small rainfall event or even a larger rainfall event and the grass has not responded to that fertilizer, and so that means we put out the fertilizer, we finally got rain on it, and the plant is actually growing, elongating, getting taller, getting leafier, it has responded. If that has not happened, again, do not graze. It can be frustrating to see this grass there that is starting possibly to grow, and it's really tempting to turn animals out. it's not safe to do so. So let's hold them off of those areas for as long as possible. Thinking about just weed management from a bigger aspect, there's a lot that you'll hear us talk about over as we go into this season about managing different or components of the forage system to prevent weeds. Because if any one of these puzzle pieces fall out, we have a chance for weeds to come in. The one that is most relevant for you today is going to be thinking about where your hay or baleage, in this case here, the picture, think about where it's coming from, what species may be in there, and then where we are feeding that out so that we are not bringing in potentially invasive weed species to the farm or moving them around our operation, and let's keep them contained. This is my general one-stop shop of weed control recommendations. This is the time of year that the one there in blue would be the most pressing. This is normally when we start scouting for those annual broadleaf weeds, toxic or not, and because they need to be controlled and they are 2 to 4 inches tall. That being said, when we are in a severe drought, these weeds may follow a slightly different timeline. So we may need to hold off spraying that herbicide until we know that those weeds are going to be there at that ideal growth stage. We also want to think ahead as to what we're planting this winter, because if we're coming out of a hard winter. If we have a hard summer season, we are greatly going to rely on those winter annual forages. And so we want to make sure that when we're spraying herbicides this time of year and throughout the summer, that we're not doing something that will prevent our winter annuals from being planted, especially on a large acreage. So that decision is up to the producer, and we can help talk through those options on a case by case basis. But overall, that is just a word of caution of let's think before we put out those herbicides, because we don't want to impact grazing now or grazing later. So we do have our YouTube channel for Georgia Forages. There is a more general drought talk on there, but it's more easily found through that UGA Beef Drought Hub, and will be shared a lot, I'm sure, over the next couple weeks. So if you're not tired of hearing about drought and forage systems, we do have a specific talk on there that goes through the layers of drought or the levels of drought and what just practical forage management we can do to help kind of prolong the livelihood of that system. So with that, I can stop to take any questions here. I haven't seen any in the chat, but you're welcome to add those now. We can address those.
Yeah, while people are maybe putting things to the chat, I have a few questions or maybe some comments to bounce off of you. So,
Yeah.
you mentioned the weather event and trees coming down. I think that's often overlooked and ends up being a problem for folks. Obviously the black cherry trees. Are there any other trees? I mean, we could probably see some issues maybe with oak trees. I don't know. It's out of the world of forages, so I'm not going to hold you to any of that, but
No.
just bouncing some stuff off of you.
Yeah, there are lots of trees. Oaks are another big category that can cause some animal health issues. I get the most calls on cherry trees. I think because they grow and volunteer very readily, and whereas some of more of the hardwoods don't. Uh, that's why we get those. They're more likely to encroach on a fence line, and then when we have a significant weather event, they're the first thing that the animal's going to step across that down fence and find. So there are certainly a lot of different species out there. And I'm by no means an expert in all of them or can easily identify them, but there's a lot of tools out there that can help us get to that. And so I just encourage everyone, because you may not know what all those species looked like, but if you're walking your pasture or those vulnerable areas and you see something that doesn't look like a normal pasture species, take a picture of it, and so that we can figure it out before you turn those animals in. There's no harm in taking 10 to 12 pictures and sending them in all at once there, just as you're out doing that walk.
Yeah. And one thing that struck me is, lots of times people are kind of stocked right at the break even point, and then when we have a drought, we're obviously overstocked, right? And then the trees come down, And there may be even rain coming down, but the grass hasn't grown yet, and so we have to remember that they're still searching for something to graze on. And from a pasture standpoint, and this is maybe we'll get into next week with Lawton when we have the byproducts talk. Any kind of tips maybe from your perspective as a forage specialist? How do we keep these cattle from looking out and searching for grazing? When was it just putting out more hay? Is that the best key, or what do you think?
So I am a strong supporter of instituting on your farm what we call a sacrifice lot. So when forage is limited across every acre on your farm, let's pick one pasture and hold the animals there. That way it's easier to scout, it's easier to manage, and we're not potentially leading to detriment in all those other pastures. That's going to be the area where, just like you alluded to, Jason, we're going to continue feeding hay. We'd feed whatever supplementation needed to support that hay, because often our hay is not sufficient on its own, especially during this late spring period. But that it keeps the herd more manageable. It lets us be able to scout and control things better, and allows all those other good pastures time to rest and regrow and respond to that precipitation and those fertilizer events.
Mhm. And you mentioned a lot about uh, the trees. I shouldn't say a lot, but I'm going to take up one more or two more topics here. So on the trees, before we get to another question, I've seen some cattle consume acorns in abundance. Any comments on acorns or acorn trees or anything like that?
So I actually don't get a lot of calls on those, and I'm surprised by it because I've seen it myself where I think they're curious and they're like you said, they're searching for food, and it's something different. But I don't personally have a lot of experience with handling those particular calls, but it's one that will drift up on that list as well.
Yeah, I had a producer call a year or two ago, and he's like, "Oh, there's something wrong with this cow. There's something wrong with this cow," and I forget. She eventually died. I can't remember what happened, but she had probably a couple hundred acorns in her gut,
Wow.
and
Wow.
obviously there's some tannins in there. Probably obviously some toxicity from that, but a curiosity probably. She got a hankering for them. One
Yeah,
other
when
thing.
we post
Go ahead.
that bulletin online, it lists specific symptoms for each one of those species, and there's several other resources available online if you want more information. I use Colorado State's vet page a lot.
Mhm.
They go into specific animal symptoms for a wide host of toxic weed species. So they don't all grow here, but it's really intriguing. And what you'll notice as you look into that is you need to have a good feel for how your animals behave normally, because they tend to tell us that something's wrong before we hit an extreme point. So things like nervous behavior, they're kind of lethargic, laying around, like those are important things to note for when we get the call of a suspected toxicity issue. Too often I'll get the call, and I'm sure you do too, of, well, they just went down. There's a lot of ways that a cow or other livestock can go down, and we need to know those details in advance. But a lot of them are tied to the animal's natural behavior. So if you have cattle that are normally very calm and suddenly they're running away from you and don't aren't interested in come to see you at the feed bunk, that's alarming. But that, for another producer that may their animals may not see them as often,
Mhm.
that may be a normal day for them. So it's going to the way that those symptoms are interpreted for your herd are going to be a little different.
Yeah. And last question from me, at least, and then hopefully, if you guys have some questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Lots of times when I see some issues, maybe with some perilla mint, it's like in a shady spot where
Mhm.
kind of maybe not in the pasture, but off maybe in the edge of the woods. I think you brought up a point. You got to scout for them, right? And you need to kind of get some ID, particularly on perilla mint, and just go out there with a backpack sprayer. Is that what you would suggest?
It depends on how widespread the weeds are. A lot of times, a small ATV sprayer is
Mhm.
sufficient with a
Yeah.
6 to 12 foot boom, because you can just spray your fence lines and you're fine.
Mhm.
I most of these species tend to prefer shady areas, which is why they're in home gardens and landscapes and woodlands and not in the middle of a pasture. They can get there. I'm not saying they can't, but they do prefer shady, wet, kind of marginal areas. That's where they've kind of found their niche within the ecosystem. So that helps us then go to scout those areas. For some of them, it's we'll just spot spray. If you just have a few out there, go dig them up or spot spray, and then use as little herbicide as possible overall. Especially this time of year when our in a drought, when we're going through that spring green up or transition period, and our good plants are this stressed, we got to be careful for some of these herbicides that may not normally have activity on those good grasses, but they could show injury during this time of year under these conditions. So do be cautious of that. And there are some, especially when you get into the woody side of things, we've got to be careful if you're spraying something to control a woody species near a tree line. The herbicide doesn't know a good tree from a bad tree, and so we've got to be careful if we're spraying, especially up near like pecan trees and things like that, that are really susceptible to herbicides, of making sure that we've got the right product controlling the invasive or toxic species and not harming that system.
Yeah, and so I think when people are out scouting, there's a lot to consider. But the my hillbilly version of looking at this is you need to look in places you wouldn't normally walk. You need to the nooks and crannies of your pastures or your paddocks and places you wouldn't normally look, right? Because the cattle are going to
Mhm.
go anywhere and everywhere. And so you gave some great tips today, Dr. Baxter. I greatly appreciate your time. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to Lisa. She's got some social media contact there. And if you have any questions that I can pass along to her, please feel free to reach out to myself as well via email or phone. Don't hesitate either to reach out to your extension agent in your local county for the questions you may have, and they'd be willing and able to work with you as well. So, with that, guys, thank you, and we'll see you next Thursday at 12:30 for byproducts with Dr. Stewart. Thank you, guys.